Sarah Martinez stood in the long security line at Denver International Airport, her worn military duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across her tired face as she shuffled forward with the other passengers. She had been traveling for nearly 18 hours, making her way back from a deployment that had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand. The young woman ahead of her complained loudly about the wait time to her boyfriend, gesturing dramatically with her perfectly manicured hands. Sarah almost smiled at the display of impatience. If only this girl knew what real waiting felt like. Real waiting was lying flat on your stomach for 6 hours in the desert sand, watching through a scope for movement that might never come. Real waiting was counting the minutes until your convoy could move through a checkpoint, knowing that each second could be your last. When Sarah finally reached the metal detector, she placed her bag in the plastic bin with practiced efficiency. She had done this routine countless times over the past 5 years of service. Remove the laptop, take off the boots, empty the pockets. The TSA agent barely glanced at her as she walked through the scanner, arms raised above her head. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual quick wave through, the agent monitoring the X-ray machine called out to his supervisor. Sarah watched as they huddled around the screen, pointing at something in her bag. Her heart rate quickened slightly, though she couldn't imagine what could be causing the delay. She had packed carefully, following all the regulations she knew by heart. "Ma'am, we need to inspect your bag," the supervisor announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had delivered this line thousands of times before. Sarah nodded and followed him to the inspection table, where her duffel bag waited like evidence in a crime scene. The supervisor was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes that had probably seen every conceivable item that travelers tried to bring through security. His name tag read Jim, and he handled her belongings with more care than most TSA agents bothered to show. As he unzipped the main compartment, Sarah felt a strange vulnerability, as if he were opening a window into her soul. Her military uniforms were folded with precision that only came from years of habit. Combat boots sat heavy and scuffed at the bottom of the bag, their leather worn smooth from countless miles walked in hostile territory. A small medical kit, regulation issue, contained the basic supplies that had become second nature for her to carry. Everything was exactly as it should be, yet the agents continued to search with growing interest. Jim's hands moved carefully through her possessions, treating each item with the respect due to someone who had clearly served their country. He found her military ID buried in a side pocket, and his demeanor shifted slightly as he read the information printed there. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, United States Army, Special Operations. The ID photo showed a younger version of herself, taken before her first deployment, when her eyes still held a certain innocence that war had since erased. "Special Ops, huh?" Jim said quietly, his voice carrying a note of respect. "My son's in the Army, too. Just finished basic training at Fort Moore." Sarah nodded politely, accustomed to these brief connections that strangers made when they learned about her service. Everyone had a relative or friend who had served, and they all wanted to share that connection, however distant. But Jim's search continued, and Sarah began to wonder what exactly they had seen on the X-ray that warranted this level of attention. She watched his hands move through the smaller pockets, past the energy bars she always carried, past the small photos of her unit that she kept as reminders of the people who had become her family over the years of deployment. Then his fingers found something that made him pause. From a zippered pocket she rarely opened, he pulled out a small object wrapped carefully in a piece of camouflage fabric. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized what he held. It was something she had forgotten was even there, something that had traveled with her for so long it had become part of the bag's permanent contents. Jim unwrapped the fabric slowly, revealing a military challenge coin. But this wasn't just any challenge coin. The weight and feel of it immediately told him this was something special. The metal gleamed dully under the security area's bright lights, and as he turned it over in his hands, the significance of what he held began to dawn on him. On one side of the coin was the emblem of the Navy SEALs, the eagle clutching a trident, anchor, and flintlock pistol that represented the three domains where SEALs operated air, sea, and land. But it was the other side that made Jim's eyes widen. Engraved, there was a unit designation that he recognized from news reports and military documentaries. This wasn't just any SEAL team coin. This was from DevGru, the elite of the elite, the unit that operated in the deepest shadows of America's special operations. Jim looked up at Sarah with new eyes, trying to reconcile the tired young woman standing before him with the implications of what he held in his hands. Deborah didn't hand out coins lightly. These weren't souvenirs or tokens of appreciation given to visiting dignitaries. These coins were earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of sacrifice that most people could never imagine. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with curiosity and growing respect. Sarah looked down at the coin in his hands. Memories flooding back of the night, it had been pressed in her palm by hands that would never again feel the warmth of sunlight. She remembered the weight of that moment, the gravity of what the coin represented, and the promise she had made to carry it with her always. It was a promise made in the aftermath of an operation that would never appear in any official record, in a place that didn't exist on any map, to men whose names would never be carved on any memorial wall. The other passengers in the security line began to notice the delay. Some craned their necks to see what was causing the holdup, muttering complaints about missing their flights. But Jim seemed oblivious to the growing crowd behind him. His full attention focused on the woman before him and the story that the coin in his hands was beginning to tell. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that she was about to share something that she had kept locked away in the deepest parts of her memory. The coin had traveled with her for 3 years, through 4 deployments and countless missions, always hidden away in that same pocket, always wrapped in the same piece of fabric that had once been part of a uniform that would never come home. The security checkpoint around them faded into background noise as Sarah began to explain how a simple Army staff sergeant had come to possess one of the rarest and most significant challenge coins in the American military. Her voice was steady, but Jim could hear the weight of memory behind her words, the kind of weight that came from carrying secrets that were too important to forget and too dangerous to remember. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper as she began to tell Jim about a night that had changed everything. It was March 2021, deep in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, during what would later become known as the final drawdown of American forces from the country. But for Sarah and her unit, the war was far from over. She had been assigned to a remote forward operating base that officially didn't exist, supporting missions that would never appear in any Pentagon briefing. Her role was medical support and intelligence gathering, using her fluency in Pashto and Dari to communicate with local sources who risked their lives to provide information about Taliban movements in the region. The base was little more than a collection of prefabricated buildings surrounded by concrete barriers, perched on a mountainside that offered commanding views of the valley below. During the day, it looked like any other military outpost. But at night, it came alive with the kind of activity that happened only in the shadows, when operators moved through the darkness on missions that the American public would never hear about. Sarah had been treating a local informant who had been wounded in a Taliban attack when the call came in. A high-value target had been located in a compound 30 miles north of their position. Intelligence indicated it was a meeting of senior Taliban commanders planning attacks on evacuation routes that would soon be used to withdraw American personnel and Afghan allies from the country. The mission was deemed too sensitive for regular forces. The target was in an area where the local population was sympathetic to the Taliban, and any large-scale operation would likely result in heavy casualties on both sides. What was needed was a small, precise strike that could eliminate the targets without collateral damage and without leaving any trace of American involvement. That's when DevGru arrived. Sarah had heard stories about the elite SEAL unit, but she had never worked with them directly. They arrived at the base in the early evening, their helicopter touching down just long enough to disgorge 6 figures in full combat gear before disappearing back into the night sky. Even on a base accustomed to special operations, their presence was felt immediately. The team leader introduced himself simply as Commander Stone, though Sarah suspected that wasn't his real name. He was tall and lean, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of operating in the world's most dangerous places. His eyes held the same look she had seen in veteran operators, a calmness that spoke of complete comfort with violence and death. Stone briefed his team in the base's small operations center, using satellite imagery and intelligence reports that Sarah had helped compile. The target compound was located in a narrow valley, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through a series of choke points where a small force could easily be trapped. The Taliban commanders were meeting in the main building, but intelligence indicated there were also civilians in the compound, including women and children related to the targets. The complexity of the mission was immediately apparent. A direct assault would likely result in civilian casualties that could spark international incidents during such a sensitive time in the withdrawal process. An airstrike was out of the question for the same reason. What was needed was surgical precision, the ability to eliminate the targets while leaving everyone else unharmed. Stone looked directly at Sarah as he outlined the mission parameters. "We need someone who can communicate with the civilians inside," he said. "Someone who can get them to safety before we move on the primary targets." The implication was clear. They wanted her to go with them. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she processed the request. She was a staff sergeant in the Army, not a Navy SEAL. Her job was medical support and intelligence gathering, not direct action missions. But she also understood the strategic importance of what they were attempting. The intelligence those Taliban commanders possessed could save hundreds of American and Allied lives during the evacuation process. Commander Stone explained the plan in detail. The team would insert by helicopter at a landing zone 5 miles from the target, then approach on foot through terrain that would conceal their movement. Sarah would accompany them as far as the outer perimeter, where she would use her language skills to convince any civilians to evacuate the compound through a predetermined route. Once the civilians were clear, the SEALs would move in to eliminate the primary targets. The mission carried enormous risks. If Sarah was captured or killed, it would be difficult to explain what an Army staff sergeant was doing on a Navy SEAL operation in a country where American forces were supposedly withdrawing. If the mission failed and became public, it could derail the entire evacuation process and potentially cost thousands of lives. But Sarah also understood the weight of the intelligence they had gathered. The Taliban commanders meeting in that compound were planning coordinated attacks on evacuation routes, airport facilities, and refugee processing centers. The information she had helped develop painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to maximize American and Allied casualties during the withdrawal. She looked around the operations center at the faces of the SEAL team members. These men had dedicated their lives to missions like this, operating in the shadows so that others could live in the light. They were asking her to join them not because they needed another gun, but because they needed her specific skills to ensure the mission could be completed without innocent blood on their hands. "I'll do it," she said quietly, and Stone nodded with the kind of respect reserved for someone who understood both the risks and the necessity of what they were attempting. The preparation time was minimal. Sarah was issued night vision equipment and a communication headset that would keep her connected to the team throughout the mission. She checked and double-checked her medical kit, knowing that in a worst-case scenario, she might be the only thing standing between life and death for any wounded team members. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting the valley in deep shadows, the team made their final preparations. Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission butterflies in her stomach, the mixture of fear and anticipation that came before stepping into the unknown. But there was something else too, a sense of purpose that went beyond duty or orders. This mission could save lives, both American and Afghan, during one of the most dangerous periods in the country's recent history. The helicopter that would take them to the insertion point was a modified Black Hawk, stripped of all identifying markings and equipped with advanced stealth technology that would make it nearly invisible to radar. As Sarah climbed aboard with the SEAL team, She felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar piece of equipment. Commander Stone handed her something just before takeoff, a small object wrapped in camouflage fabric. "In case things go sideways," he said simply. "Make sure it gets home." Sarah tucked the wrapped object into her pocket without looking at it, understanding instinctively that some gifts were too significant to examine in the moment of receiving. The flight to the insertion point took 45 minutes, following a route that took them through mountain passes and valleys where the helicopter's noise would be masked by the terrain. Sarah watched the landscape pass beneath them through her night vision goggles, seeing the green-tinted world that had become as familiar to her as her hometown streets. As they approached the landing zone, she could feel the tension in the aircraft ratchet up several notches. This was the moment when theory became reality, when careful planning met the chaotic unpredictability of combat. In a few minutes, she would be on the ground in enemy territory, carrying the hopes of her nation and the trust of 6 elite operators who were depending on her to help them complete one of the most important missions of their careers. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, its landing lights dark to avoid detection. Sarah felt her boots hit Afghan soil for what she somehow knew would be the last time, though she couldn't have explained why. That certainty settled over her like a familiar blanket. The SEAL team moved with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated through years of training and operations together. Commander Stone took point as they began the 5-mile trek to the target compound. Sarah found herself in the middle of the formation, surrounded by operators whose names she would never know, but whose presence gave her confidence that few things in life had ever provided. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, their night vision equipment turning the treacherous mountain terrain into a navigable green-tinted landscape. The approach took 3 hours, moving carefully through terrain that could hide Taliban sentries or improvised explosive devices. Sarah's medical training kicked in automatically as she monitored her own physical condition and that of the team around her. Heart rate elevated but manageable, breathing controlled despite the altitude and exertion, equipment secure and functioning properly. When they reached the outer perimeter of the target compound, Sarah could see the layout match their intelligence perfectly. A main building housed the meeting of Taliban commanders, while smaller structures around the perimeter contained sleeping quarters and storage areas. Thermal imaging confirmed the presence of multiple individuals in the main building, but also showed heat signatures in the smaller buildings that intelligence indicated were civilian family members. Stone's voice crackled quietly through her headset. "This is where you earn your pay, Sergeant." The plan required her to approach the civilian quarters and convince the occupants to evacuate through a predetermined route that would take them safely away from the compound before the SEALs moved in. The challenge was doing this without alerting the Taliban commanders in the main building. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, then began her approach to the first of the civilian buildings. Her years of working with Afghan locals served her well as she moved carefully through the shadows, avoiding the areas where motion sensors or guards might detect her presence. The building appeared to house an extended family, women and children related to one of the Taliban commanders. She announced her presence in soft Pashto, identifying herself as a friend who had come to warn them of danger. The response from inside was immediate fear and confusion. A woman's voice asked who was there and what she wanted. Sarah explained quickly that there would be fighting soon, and that she had come to guide them to safety. The conversation that followed tested every skill she had developed in cultural communication and human psychology. The family was terrified of both the Taliban commanders and any unknown person who appeared in the night. Sarah had to convince them that trusting her was their only path to survival, while doing so quietly enough to avoid alerting the guards she knew were positioned around the main building. It took 20 minutes of careful persuasion before the first family agreed to follow her. An elderly woman, her daughter, and 3 small children crept quietly from their building and followed Sarah along the evacuation route Stone had established. The children were silent with the kind of discipline that came from living in a war zone their entire lives. Sarah repeated this process 2 more times, evacuating a total of 13 civilians from the compound. Each approach carried the risk of discovery. Each conversation required her to build trust with people who had every reason to fear strangers in the night. But her language skills and cultural knowledge, combined with a genuine compassion for the innocent people caught in the crossfire of larger conflicts, proved sufficient to the task. With the civilians safely evacuated, Sarah confirmed their status to Stone and prepared to withdraw to her overwatch position. The SEAL team would now move in to eliminate the Taliban commanders, armed with intelligence that would save hundreds of lives during the evacuation process. The mission was proceeding exactly as planned. That's when everything went wrong. A Taliban sentry who had been relieving himself behind one of the outer buildings spotted Sarah as she moved toward her extraction point. The man's shout of alarm echoed across the compound, instantly alerting everyone inside to the presence of intruders. The carefully planned operation became a firefight in the span of seconds. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as the Taliban commanders and their bodyguards responded to the threat. The SEALs adapted instantly, switching from stealth to direct action as they engaged multiple targets across the compound. But the loss of surprise meant the mission parameters had fundamentally changed. Sarah found herself pinned down between the main building and her extraction point, caught in a crossfire as Taliban fighters attempted to establish defensive positions. Her medical training kicked in as she heard one of the SEALs call for immediate assistance over the radio. The voice belonged to Stone, and there was something in his tone that told her the situation was critical. She low-crawled across 50 meters of open ground under enemy fire, following the sound of Stone's voice to a position behind a low stone wall. What she found there would remain burned in her memory forever. Commander Stone had taken a high-velocity round through his torso, and blood was pooling beneath him despite the emergency medical care his team members were applying. Sarah immediately took charge of the medical situation, her training overriding the chaos around them. She established in 4-line and began administering trauma care, while the other SEALs maintained defensive fire against the Taliban fighters. Stone remained conscious, but was losing blood faster than her field medical supplies could replace. "The intelligence," he whispered to her as she worked, "has to get home. Operation details, target lists, everything." He pressed a small device into her hands, an encrypted data storage unit that contained the information they had risked everything to obtain. "Promise me." Sarah understood immediately what he was asking. The intelligence on that device was more important than any individual life, including her own. If the Taliban commanders escaped, or if the operation details were compromised, the evacuation process would become exponentially more dangerous for thousands of American and Allied personnel. She promised and meant it with every fiber of her being. The firefight continued for another 30 minutes before the surviving SEALs were able to eliminate the remaining Taliban fighters. But the mission had come at a cost that weighed heavily on everyone involved. Commander Stone died during the helicopter extraction, his hands still gripping the challenge coin he had tried to give back to Sarah before losing consciousness. "He wanted you to have it," the team's medic told her later as they flew back to base. "Said you'd earned it tonight." Sarah looked down at the coin in her hands, understanding for the first time the weight of what it represented. This wasn't just a token of appreciation or a souvenir. It was a symbol of brotherhood earned through shared sacrifice in the darkest places human conflict could create. The intelligence they recovered from the mission proved invaluable during the evacuation process. The Taliban attack plans were disrupted, saving an estimated 300 American and Allied lives during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But the cost of obtaining that intelligence was measured in more than just the life of Commander Stone. Sarah never spoke about the mission to anyone outside of the classified debriefing reports. The operation remained buried in the kind of black budget programs that operated beyond public scrutiny or congressional oversight. Commander Stone's name would never appear on any memorial wall, and his sacrifice would never be acknowledged in any public ceremony. But Sarah carried his memory and his challenge coin with her through every day that followed. She wrapped it carefully in a piece of Stone's uniform that the team had given her, and She placed it in her bag where it would travel with her always. It was a reminder of what service really meant and of the price that others had paid so that she could live to tell their story. Standing in that airport security checkpoint 3 years later, with TSA Supervisor Jim holding Stone's coin in his hands, Sarah felt the weight of that night settling over her once again. The story had never been told, the sacrifice had never been acknowledged, and the heroes had never been honored. But perhaps she thought that was how it was supposed to be. Some stories were too important to remain untold, but too dangerous to tell publicly. Jim looked up at her with new understanding, recognizing that he held something far more significant than a simple military coin. This was a piece of American history that would never appear in any textbook, a symbol of sacrifice that had been earned in the shadows and carried in silence. "Thank you," he said simply, carefully rewrapping the coin in its camouflage fabric before placing it back in Sarah's bag. Around them, the airport security checkpoint continued its normal operations, but something had changed in that small space between them. A story had been shared, a sacrifice had been acknowledged, and a promise made in the mountains of Afghanistan had finally been kept. Sarah continued through security and onto her flight, carrying with her the weight of memory and the honor of those who had fallen in the service of their country. The coin remained in her bag, wrapped in fabric from a uniform that would never come home, a reminder that some prices are worth paying and some stories are worth carrying, even when they can never be fully told.